Sure. Here's section 1 with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag section 1. Introduction to HFY and the role of translation errors in storytelling. The HFY genre, short for humanity, F******, has carved out a unique and passionate corner of speculative fiction, particularly on platforms like Reddit. At its heart, HFY is a celebration of humanity through the lens of science fiction. Whether it's our stubbornness, empathy, ingenuity, brutality, adaptability, or even our reckless curiosity, HFY stories amplify these traits and set them against alien backdrops to ask one central question: what if humans are the wild cards of the universe? HFY stories often imagine humanity as late arrivals on the galactic stage, surrounded by highly advanced civilizations that are bound by rigid logic, ethical codes, or even biological limitations. Then humans show up, irrational, emotional, chaotic, but endlessly creative, and proceed to break all expectations. Sometimes we terrify. Sometimes we inspire. Sometimes we just confuse everyone. And it's this confusion, particularly when it stems from language, that opens up one of HFY's most compelling subgenres: translation errors. Hashtag. What makes translation errors so effective in HFY? At a basic level, translation errors in science fiction serve as a narrative device to explore cultural differences. They are often played for laughs or as the catalyst for plot-driving misunderstandings, but when written well, they can say a lot about the nature of communication, context, and perspective. In HFY, translation errors are especially potent because they highlight how alien the human experience might look to outsiders. Our languages are littered with idioms, slang, double meanings, cultural references, and emotional undertones. When aliens attempt to interpret phrases like "break a leg," "killing it out there," or "this food is fire," they're often left bewildered or, hilariously, terrified. These mistranslations are more than punchlines. They reflect deeper ideas about how we as humans package meaning in our communication and how easily that meaning can be lost or distorted when viewed from an unfamiliar lens. Some HFY writers have taken this idea and turned it into an art form, weaving clever misunderstandings into narratives where humans are revered, feared, or grossly misinterpreted based on what they say. The stories often show aliens making the mistake of interpreting human metaphors or sarcasm literally, leading to absurd, hilarious, or even dangerous situations. But they also reveal how central communication is to understanding, not just language, but intent, emotion, and culture. Hashtag the human narrator, a voice from the inside. A key reason HFY stories resonate so strongly is the use of the human narrator. In many cases, the protagonist is a human explaining events from a personal point of view, whether it's through logs, journal entries, inner monologue, or casual storytelling. The human narrator gives readers a familiar foothold in the strange, vast universe of alien civilizations. Their voice is often sarcastic, self-deprecating, and infused with the kind of dry humor that only a human audience would fully appreciate. This narration becomes especially important in translation error stories. While the aliens are fumbling with language, the narrator often provides biting commentary, letting us in on the joke or the disconnect. The contrast between what the aliens think is happening and what is actually going on becomes even more humorous or dramatic when filtered through a human's casually amused, sometimes panicked, or blissfully unaware perspective. What makes these narrators so powerful is their relatability. They are rarely perfect. They mess up, get frustrated, make jokes in the wrong situations, and sometimes forget how confusing their own culture can be. But it's through this flawed, genuine lens that the reader experiences the full absurdity and sometimes the quiet brilliance of how humans operate in a larger universe. Hashtag introducing Useful-Gap-2152, a master of the form. One Reddit user who has become particularly known for this niche is Useful-Gap-2152. With a flair for combining clever translation errors with deeply human narrators, this author's stories stand out in the HFY community for their balance of humor, insight, and storytelling. Their narratives often start with a simple misunderstanding, an idiom taken literally, a joke lost in translation, and escalate to full-blown diplomatic crises, military confusion, or cross-species friendships. Useful-Gap-2152's work is emblematic of what makes HFY and the translation error subgenre so enjoyable. They understand that language isn't just about words, it's about shared meaning, emotion, and context. And when that context is lost or twisted, it reveals just how unique and confusing humanity can be. Their stories frequently feature human protagonists navigating situations where aliens either fear them unnecessarily or idolize them for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes these characters try to correct the mistake. Other times, they roll with it for comedic or strategic effect. Either way, the result is a story that shines a light on how truly strange we are when viewed from the outside. ####, where we're headed. In the sections to come, we'll explore some of the top stories by Useful-Gap-2152 that make expert use of translation errors, breaking down how miscommunication drives the plot and enhances the humor. We'll also dive into how the narrator's voice shapes the tone, adds layers to the misunderstanding, and helps humanize the otherwise alien setting. Finally, we'll discuss why translation errors aren't just entertaining, they're meaningful, offering commentary on cultural identity, misinterpretation, and the beauty of trying to understand someone completely different. Stay tuned. Things are about to get hilariously lost in translation. Let me know if you'd like me to move on to Section 2, or make any edits here. Absolutely. Here's Section 2 with a minimum of 700 words. #Section 2, Top Translation Error Stories by Useful-Gap-2152. In the ever-growing world of HFY fiction, few authors use the concept of translation errors as creatively and consistently as Useful-Gap-2152. Their stories range from laugh-out-loud comedy to insightful social commentary, often hinging on just a few mistranslated words. But behind the humor lies a clever examination of how language, meaning, and culture are so deeply entangled that even the most advanced alien civilizations can't quite make sense of us. Let's take a closer look at 4 standout stories where translation blunders turn into moments of chaos, revelation, or unexpected connection. #Story 1. We Thought They Were Gods. In this hilarious piece, a group of aliens intercepts the audio feed from an early human space mission. Hearing phrases like, "Houston, we have a problem," and "Godspeed, John Glenn," they come to the bizarre conclusion that these transmissions are some sort of divine incantations. Lacking a cultural context for technical language and space-age expressions, the aliens believe humanity is not only technologically superior, but also spiritually ascendant. The story unfolds with the aliens attempting to replicate these ritual phrases in their own tongue, causing their translators to crash repeatedly. Meanwhile, the human narrator, an astronaut years later, reflects on the first contact event with a mix of awe and disbelief. The aliens revere human astronauts as messengers of a divine force, and every garbled command from mission control becomes sacred doctrine. The brilliance of this story lies in the contrast between the reverent, almost religious interpretation of routine communication and the human narrator's bemused, slightly embarrassed reactions. Translation errors aren't just funny here, they're foundational, completely rewriting how an alien species understands us. #Story 2, The Meat Problem. In this unsettling yet ultimately heartwarming tale, a diplomatic meeting between humans and an herbivorous alien race goes sideways when the aliens catch snippets of human conversation about grilling ribs and slow-roasting dinner. Their translator, unable to contextualize the slang or culinary euphemisms, delivers a horrifying summary. *, the humans are planning to cook a sentient being alive for recreational nourishment. *, panic ensues. The aliens think humans engage in ritualistic torture via open flame and begin preparing evacuation plans. One particularly bold alien diplomat sneaks into the kitchen to gather intelligence, only to find a slow cooker full of beef brisket and a group of humans passionately debating whether barbecue sauce should be vinegar-based or tomato-based. The climax features the human narrator explaining the concept of comfort food and showing the alien how cooking is not torture, but rather a shared experience of joy, culture, and sometimes grief. The misunderstanding becomes a bridge, leading to a shared meal and a budding interspecies friendship. Here, the translation error is used not only for comedic tension but also to explore cultural norms. What one species views as horrifying, another sees as hospitality. The narrator's casual tone and slow realization of what's gone wrong are key to building both the humor and emotional payoff. Story 3. No kill like overkill. This story leans heavily into military HFY, where a routine training exercise leads to a full-blown interstellar panic. When a human unit demonstrates a show of force for alien allies, the translator bot, overloaded with slang and hyperbole, renders the soldiers' banter in the most literal, terrifying terms. Phrases like light 'em up, scorched earth, and nuke it from orbit are translated into messages akin to asterisk, we shall eliminate all life forms and leave the planet uninhabitable. Asterisk, the aliens, already nervous around their human counterparts, interpret the demo as a preview of planetary annihilation. Their report back home causes an emergency summit of galactic powers. Meanwhile, the human narrator, a mid-level officer with a love for 80s action movies, slowly realizes how their culture's obsession with over-the-top phrasing can be misread. At one point, he even says, asterisk, I guess we really don't have an off switch when it comes to flair for the dramatic. Asterisk. What makes this story shine is its commentary on how bravado, especially in military contexts, doesn't always translate well, especially to more reserved or pacifist species. It also shows how humor and exaggeration, while harmless among humans, can be perceived as threats by outsiders unfamiliar with our idioms. Story 4. Diplomatic immunity. Perhaps one of the most clever stories in Useful-Gap-2152's repertoire, this piece explores a diplomatic encounter where the human ambassador, frustrated by red tape, utters the phrase, asterisk, my hands are tied. Asterisk, the alien negotiators immediately assume this is a form of coercive ritual, believing humans physically bind their diplomats as a sign of sincerity or legal restriction. They respond by restraining one of their own officials in an attempt to mirror what they think is a cultural expectation. The situation escalates until a human aide finally realizes the mistake and frantically explains that hands are tied is just a metaphor for bureaucratic helplessness. Throughout the story, the human narrator is blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling in the background until the very end. The humor comes from the reader being in on the misunderstanding before the characters figure it out. The resolution involves both sides sitting down and listing out metaphors that should not be taken literally, which becomes the foundation for an interspecies handbook on contextual idioms in Terran English. This story is a perfect example of HFY's ability to use something as mundane as a common phrase to spin out a whole narrative arc of confusion, diplomacy, and eventual understanding. Common patterns and observations. Across these stories, a few patterns emerge. First, idioms and slang are nearly always the culprit in translation breakdowns. Phrases that feel natural and even casual to humans carry deeply confusing or threatening meanings when stripped of context. Second, the human narrator is critical, not just as a storyteller, but as a cultural translator. Their commentary provides insight, humor, and grounding. Finally, Useful-Gap-2152 uses these misunderstandings not just to entertain, but to explore broader themes: the fragility of communication, the risks of assumption, and the unexpected bridges between species that start with a simple error. By leaning into the humor and heart of these stories, Useful-Gap-2152 shows us how even chaos can lead to connection. Let me know if you'd like to continue with Section 3, or want to expand on one of these stories more. Absolutely. Here's Section 3 with at least 700 words, focusing on the power of the human voice, narration, irony, and cultural clash in HFY stories, especially those by Useful-Gap-2152. Section 3. The power of the human voice, narration, irony, and cultural clash. In the realm of HFY fiction, the human narrator plays a crucial role, not just as a storyteller, but as a lens through which we experience the strangeness of the wider universe. Whether they're facing down an alien tribunal, explaining barbecue to an herbivorous species, or accidentally starting a war with a badly phrased idiom, the human narrator serves as our guide, our comic relief, and sometimes our confessor. In the stories written by Useful-Gap-2152, the narrator is more than a voice. They are the heartbeat of the tale. Their tone, personality, and perspective shape how the reader perceives every misunderstanding, every cultural clash, and every moment of accidental diplomacy. Through humor, self-awareness, and an often ironic take on events, the narrator not only grounds the sci-fi setting in something relatable, but also emphasizes the vast distance, culturally, emotionally, linguistically, between humans and everyone else. Voice as a lens of identity. Human narrators in HFY stories often wear multiple hats. They're explorers, diplomats, warriors, scientists, but more importantly, they're human. That humanity is reflected in the voice used to tell the story. This voice carries with it all the contradictions and quirks of our species: sarcasm, insecurity, humor under pressure, emotional honesty, and above all, a deep desire to be understood, even when we know we're hard to figure out. In Useful-Gap-2152's work, the narrators tend to lean into this. They often recognize the absurdity of their situations, but push forward with a kind of resigned optimism or ironic detachment. For example, a character might be watching a diplomatic catastrophe unfold because someone used the phrase "hit the ground running," and instead of panicking, they reflect, well, I guess that's what I get for trying to sound motivational. That internal monologue becomes the glue that holds the story together, anchoring bizarre events in a familiar thought process. Humor and sarcasm as narrative tools. Sarcasm is a risky narrative choice. It can easily fall flat or come off as cynical. But when it's done well, especially in contrast to alien seriousness, it becomes a powerful comedic and thematic tool. Humans use sarcasm in everyday life to diffuse tension, cope with stress, and express frustration. Aliens in these stories, however, often don't recognize sarcasm as a linguistic mode, leading to some of the most hilarious miscommunications imaginable. One of the most memorable examples from Useful-Gap-2152's collection is a scene where human, trying to downplay the threat level of a situation, jokes, "Oh sure, we'll just throw a nuke at it. Problem solved." The alien listeners interpret this as an official strategic directive and immediately begin preparing for a planetary-scale attack. The humor here isn't just in the misinterpretation, it's in how the human narrator reacts. Usually, it's with some variation of, "Oh no, that was a joke. That was so obviously a joke, wasn't it?" The narrator's incredulous inner voice mirrors the reader's reaction, building a shared space where the audience feels in on the joke, something the aliens, tragically, are not. First-person versus third-person narration. While first-person narration is often the go-to format for these stories, thanks to its intimacy and potential for humor, Useful-Gap-2152 occasionally employs third-person limited perspectives. Even when writing in third person, though, the voice remains unmistakably human. The thoughts and reactions of the character are front and center, and the narrative style often mimics inner dialogue. This flexible use of perspective allows for both personal reflection and wider commentary. In some stories, the narrator may be speaking from hindsight, adding layers of ironic distance. In others, events unfold in real time, with the narrator scrambling to keep up with alien confusion. Whether we're right there with them in the moment or hearing about it after the fact, the voice always reflects a very human way of seeing the universe, with all the messiness and meaning that entails. Cultural misalignment and irony. Perhaps the richest source of narrative tension in these stories is cultural misalignment. Humans see themselves as flexible, expressive, and intuitive. Aliens, especially those portrayed as hyperlogical or honor-bound, struggle to comprehend this. In one story, the simple phrase "break a leg" causes a diplomatic rift when translated as a literal act of aggression. The human narrator, meanwhile, is caught between trying to clarify and trying not to laugh at the absurdity. Irony emerges not just from the language itself, but from the situation. Humans consistently fail to see how weird they appear to others. The narrator often walks a fine line between frustration and empathy. Asterisk, of course they thought we were threatening them. We named the ship the Devastator and told them we were coming in hot. I'd be scared, too. Asterisk. These reflections don't just make the story funny, they make it thoughtful. They highlight how so much of communication is about assumed context. HFY stories, especially those laced with translation errors, strip that context away and force everyone to see just how fragile shared understanding can be. #empathy through narrative. One of the most impressive things about Useful-Gap-2152's narrators is their capacity for empathy, even when they're sarcastic or confused. These characters don't usually view aliens as the other, to be conquered or outwitted. They may laugh at the situation, but they often express a desire to fix the misunderstanding, to connect, and to teach. This emotional current is subtle but vital. It shows that beneath all the miscommunication, humans and aliens both want the same thing: to understand and be understood. This is where narration becomes transformative. It's not just about recounting events, it's about making meaning out of chaos. The human voice, with all its flaws and color, becomes the bridge between worlds. Through humor, reflection, and insight, the narrator helps the reader see beyond the errors and into the heart of what makes these encounters memorable. In HFY, the voice of the narrator is the voice of humanity. It's not always polished, it's often sarcastic, and it doesn't always have the answers, but it's honest. And in the hands of an author like Useful-Gap-2152, that voice becomes the perfect guide through a universe that's just trying to figure out what "that's lit" actually means. Let me know if you want to dive into Section 4 next. Absolutely. Here's Section 4 with at least 700 words, focusing on the impact of translation error stories in the HFY genre, what they reveal about humanity, and why they resonate so deeply with readers. Section 4. The deeper meaning. Why translation errors in HFY resonate so strongly. At first glance, stories about aliens misinterpreting human idioms or taking our sarcasm literally might seem like simple comedy. But as any reader of HFY, humanity fiction knows, especially the kind crafted by authors like Useful-Gap-2152, there's something deeper at play. Beneath the humor and absurdity, these stories explore profound questions about identity, culture, communication, and what it means to be human in a universe where we might be the outliers. In this final section, we'll dive into why translation error stories resonate so strongly. We'll look beyond the laughs and misunderstandings to understand how these narratives offer insight into humanity's strengths and flaws, our emotional complexity, and our ongoing struggle to be understood by those who aren't like us, whether alien or human. Communication is connection and vulnerability. One of the most universal truths these stories reveal is that communication is never just about words. It's about tone, timing, intent, cultural context, and shared understanding. In HFY stories, the breakdown of communication, whether due to a literal translation error or a deeper cultural misunderstanding, mirrors the kinds of failures we experience in real life. Misinterpretations happen all the time between humans. Now imagine multiplying that by species, worldviews, and evolutionary backgrounds. By putting humans in situations where their language is misunderstood, these stories expose the fragility of communication. At the same time, they highlight how essential it is. When an alien species misunderstands the phrase killing it to mean literal murder, it's funny, but it also forces us to think about how much meaning we carry in small, casual expressions. It shows how vulnerable we are when trying to reach out and be understood. That vulnerability is at the heart of HFY translation error stories. They remind us that every time we communicate, especially across difference, we're taking a risk. And sometimes those risks lead to warships. Other times they lead to understanding. Reframing humanity through alien eyes. A hallmark of the HFY genre is the way it reframes what we think of as normal human behavior. Through the lens of aliens who may have evolved in entirely different ways, our emotions, instincts, and speech habits become strange, even alarming. Translation errors magnify this effect. A phrase meant to express affection or encouragement might be read as a threat or declaration of dominance. But this misreading also reflects how extraordinary humans are. Our languages are full of double meanings, metaphor, sarcasm, irony, and emotional nuance. We can communicate volumes with just a glance or a raised eyebrow. We use humor to soften tragedy, exaggeration to emphasize excitement, and storytelling to share wisdom. In HFY translation error stories, these traits are both a blessing and a curse. They confuse our allies, terrify our enemies, and leave our alien friends scratching their heads. But they also set us apart. These stories celebrate the richness of human expression, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as something to be admired and embraced, even if it causes chaos. ###A mirror for real-world cultural misunderstandings. Though set in space, the themes of these stories are grounded in very real experiences. Anyone who's traveled, worked in cross-cultural environments, or even grown up in a bilingual household knows how easy it is for things to get lost in translation. HFY stories simply crank that dial up to 11 by replacing cultural differences with interspecies ones. In this way, translation error stories become powerful allegories. They show how easy it is to misunderstand others when we assume our own norms are universal. They remind us of the need for empathy, patience, and humor when communicating across differences. And perhaps most importantly, they show that mistakes in communication, while awkward or even dangerous, can also lead to growth, connection, and shared laughter. It's no coincidence that in many of Useful-Gap-2152 stories, the resolution comes not from a translator device, but from a conversation. From someone sitting down and saying, "Actually, this is what I meant." That willingness to clarify, to explain, to be open and vulnerable, that's the heart of diplomacy, friendship, and ultimately, peace. ###Why these stories stick with us. So why do these stories, built around what are essentially comedic misunderstandings, stay with readers long after the punchline? The answer lies in their layered emotional impact. Yes, they make us laugh, but they also make us reflect. They ask us, what does it mean to be human? How do we communicate who we are to others? What happens when we're not understood? And what do we do about it? There's also something uniquely comforting about these narratives. In a world where miscommunication can lead to conflict and confusion, the idea that even the most disastrous misunderstanding can be resolved with dialogue, empathy, and a shared meal is deeply reassuring. It speaks to a kind of hopeful optimism, a belief that despite all the things that make us weird, chaotic, or hard to understand, humanity still has something worthwhile to offer the universe. And let's not forget the sheer creativity of it all. The idioms chosen, the wild alien reactions, the slow, dawning horror on the part of the human narrator when they realize, wait, they took that literally? There's joy in that kind of storytelling, a joy rooted in linguistic play, cultural contrast, and the beautiful absurdity of trying to bridge the gap between worlds. ###The legacy of Useful-Gap-2152 stories. Through translation errors, human narrators, and a relentless focus on how messy and meaningful communication can be, Useful-Gap-2152 has carved out a lasting legacy within the HFY genre. Their stories remind us that language is not just a tool, it's a reflection of who we are. That even when our words fail us, our intent, humor, and humanity can still shine through. In the end, these stories aren't just about aliens misinterpreting Earth slang. They're about the power of words, the challenges of connection, and the wonder of being human in a universe that doesn't speak our language, but might still want to understand us anyway. Let me know if you'd like the full 2,800-word outline compiled as one document, or if you want to create additional content, like a short story inspired by this theme.